things that I find interesting about your way you talk about austerity as a means of disciplining the basically the worker and making sure the capital flows upward towards the 1% is that it's a project of not only the right but also taken up by the left, particularly the those political economies governed by governments that assume to be left leaning. Why is it that we find that left leaning governments like
Yeah.
Lula in Brazil and others are so willing to take up austerity so quickly? Are they just quickly surrendering to the capitalist realism that predates them? Or is it a lack of economic imagination on their part? Because every time I see austerity, I find it's being ushered in by a left wing administration.
Is it pressure from the
Yeah.
for example, someone like Lula or Brazil? Is it pressure from kind of a bit of a powerful right that does exist in Brazil, or is it just kind of the goals of the administration of someone like Lula? And in left media over the last 8 years or so, Lula has been a bit of a celebrity,
Yeah.
which is kind of shocking because there's also other people in Latin America that have lifted millions of people out of poverty due to their economic program. But why did you look at Lula in particular?
Yeah. To me, yeah. These are fundamental questions, and I think it is a bit of both. There's the pressure, but there's also, the fact that if you do want to manage a capitalist economy, austerity is the fallback point because it does kind of guarantee the fundamentals for our economy. So to better answer your question, maybe we should just define what austerity is for people, given that it's not really a term that is used very often.
Yeah.
When we talk about austerity, usually what people think it is increasing taxes and cutting public expenditure. This is a very bad definition because it really doesn't tell you at all about the class dimension of austerity and where the resources are actually taken from and who are they taken to. And so what you find out is that austerity is regressive taxation, so meaning that actually labor is structurally taxed much less than capital. And this is really hugely the case in the United States, as in Brazil, is that, those who make a living out of interest and dividends pay far fewer taxes than those who make a living through wages, right? So this is the regressivity of our fiscal system that we know is really embedded in the way they tax us, right? You increase the consumption taxes. Well, there's basically no inheritance taxes. We know that big corporations pay $0 in federal income taxes, most of them. So this is what we see, not just in the United States, but also in Brazil and many other places. And at the same time, once the state taxes the working people, the money, where does this money go? It doesn't go to fulfill our basic needs of health, education, transportation, public housing. It usually goes to actually de-risk and incentivize and subsidize private investors. And of course, the most obvious glaring example right now of this is the genocide in Gaza and the way in which the value of the shares of multiple corporations directly and indirectly engaged in the massacre of Palestinians and now Lebanese people are actually skyrocketing, right? RTX increased its value of more than 70% since October 7th of 2023. So what we're seeing here is clearly the state basically providing constant demand and constant subsidies for big shareholders, while at the cost of literally the death and the suffering of people's livelihood, right? So this is austerity capitalism. It's the structural shifting of resources away from the working class people through regressive taxation, through cuts in social expenditures, while the state is actively spending a ton of money, of course, in the carceral state, in the big military industrial complex, and green energy, and much more, right? All in the hands of private investors and large asset managers. This goes with monetary austerity usually, which we see today still, which is like very high interest rates. What do high interest rates mean? They don't mean a neutral way to fight inflation for the good of all of us. That's the story you hear, and that's bullshit. Because actually increasing interest rate doesn't really help necessarily solve inflation, especially when inflation is due to higher than ever profit margins. What higher interest rates actually do is not only screw us as consumers when we live off of credit, as the majority of us do because we make too little and have to pay higher mortgages and bigger credit card bills. The whole point, while of course those who have money are making a ton in return of the capital they lend, the point is that we lose as workers, right? So actually what the Fed is meant to do is cool down the labor market, which means increase the unemployment rate, which is successfully doing, which means less bargaining power for workers, less unionizations, and less wins in terms of the wage share with respect to the profit share. So how much of the GDP goes to profits and how much of the GDP goes to wages. And now we're in a situation in which, and the reason why Trump won is that because people are poor and desperate, right? We know 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. This is a recent statistic. 41% of Americans can't meet their basic needs. This is what austerity capitalism is about. And monetary austerity increases the hardship on workers. And then we have industrial austerity. So I talk about this trinity, and industrial
I
austerity.
was just about to ask you about the Trinity, and
Right.
you beat me
It's
to it.
privatization, it's deregulation of labor, it's attack of the unions. Again, it's the state directly intervening to basically ensure the right balance of power between labor and capital. So this austerity trinity is, in a way, and this is important to answer your question, I would say we can reduce this to a policy mistake. The reason why I wrote my historical book was because I was so sick of these Keynesian economists that were reading the austerity wave in Europe after the 2008 debt crisis. And again, what was the debt crisis? It was the state having bailed out the banks and rescued banks using workers' money, right? And then the workers had to pay with cuts in social expenditures. So people analyzing that moment as today just say, oh, austerity is just a policy mistake. It's bad economics. You could have capitalism without austerity. And that's not true. What I want to show is that a serious Marxian analysis tells you that if you want capitalism, you have austerity. The two are interlinked. They are connected. And this is also true for the most, the least expected period, which is the so-called golden age of capitalism. My current work is about how austerity was in the core of fiscal and monetary policies, even in the United States after the Second World War. So this is what we say. Lula, if Lula is courageous to say, I want to break from wage relations and break from our dependence on private and global private investors that, of course, keep speculating against the real, especially when Lula maybe has the chance of hiring someone at the central bank who is less of an austerity hawk. Speculators react, right? And they react by basically pulling out capital and literally blackmailing the government. So Lula could go the way of saying, you know what, I'm actually going to support what is on the ground, which is, for example, the MST movement, the big movement of landless workers who are actively organizing, and they're huge, right? They have like 500,000, no more, much more. Now I'm blanking on the number. Anyway, it's the biggest organization of workers who occupy land and then organize collectively to manage it. And they're the biggest exporters of agricultural rice at this moment. So in Brazil, there's a lot of stuff going on, like workers self-managing production in agriculture. There's a lot of workers self-managing industry. There's a lot of people occupying building and organizing collective spaces to actually breach from market dependence. This is all something that, a courageous government could say, this is the way we want to organize our material conditions, not the capitalist way. But of course, it would mean a big break. So if the left doesn't want to take on that break, it does what Biden has done. I don't even consider Biden left. But anyway, what the Democrats have done with is hardcore austerity, which is the reason they are now dead as a political party. Like, this electoral result just speaks very widely to the fact that people have been impoverished, are sick of the system, and are saying no. Now, the problem is that, of course, austerity makes us very vulnerable and docile, and often then limits the capacity to think beyond the box. And that's why, Trump has a big appeal.